The Quaker by Rory, Dwayne. Why does it feel like I've lived this night before? Mike thought as he guided the bus down the road. Sometimes it feels that a night can go on forever. Even as the new day dawns, you find your mind slip back into the twilight. Who's to say we all don't exist in an eternal loop? Some soul hanging a carrot and stick over your shoulder, leading you in circles as they leech the energy from your soul. Twisted minds prefer to dwell in the unlit corners of the spiritual plane, those sinister spirits that prey on the unwary. This story is a story about one of those spirits. So wherever you are, shut the blinds, lock the door, and check under your bed, for the Quaker might be watching. A multitude of dark towers rose above the horizon. The bus driver's tired eyes gazed out of the foggy windows at a sky with no moon. Thick clouds swirled and formed above. The yellow-tinged rain splattered the bus's windows, discolored from the cheap lighting of the street lamps that passed by the bus, turning everything into a wayward Van Gogh. A name tag reflected passing headlights. New York City Transport, Mike Flanagan, appearing and disappearing as quickly as a rabbit in a hat. The bus engine hummed, struggling through another large body of water, its wipers beating together in a rhythm more familiar to the driver than his own heartbeat. The clock on the dash showed 11:34 p.m. Flanagan's bloodshot eyes stared at him through the rearview mirror, surrounded by dark sockets of pale skin. I look like a fucking zombie. Looking past his haggard face, Flanagan saw that the three passengers hadn't moved. The bus drove down the streets towards the empty bus stop. Pulling in, he waited. Only a few more stops until he'd be heading home to see Jane. An extended leave to attempt another patch-up on his already sinking marriage. The overtime and night shifts had killed all affection from their love life. All that held them together now was the little bump beginning to show on her stomach. Checking around once more, he didn't see anyone, so he pulled off. At the end of the street, he turned right. An empty train passed by overhead, the rumbling tracks barely audible under the thundering rainfall. The Weather Channel said the storm was going to be here for another day. Damn storms, he mumbled to himself. Always getting in the way of everything. Just one more night, Jane, please.
Hello?
The young man at the back of the bus answered loudly.
I can't hear you, Mom. What? Mom, why are you crying? Stop. Mom, stop crying, please.
He went silent and then hung up the flip phone and stuck it in his pocket. The color had drained from his face. The young man stared out the window, looking up at the lightning spiking through the gloomy atmosphere. Flanagan eyed him for another minute through the mirror, at the others, who were all docile and gazing at nothing. The old woman on the left hadn't spoken since getting on, and the little girl was still blowing bubbles with her chewing gum. It was funny now that he thought about it, because he couldn't remember where any of them had gotten on. Pulling into the bus stop, he waited and was about to pull back off when a heavy thumping sounded on the bus's door. He put the bus back into neutral and opened the door. A black figure was silhouetted from the headlamps. His face was barely discernible under the large-brimmed hat he wore. Hey, what are you waiting for? An invitation? Said Flanagan. The figure remained motionless. Flanagan leaned over and pulled out the torch he kept under the dash for emergencies. He switched it on and pointed it down towards the door. The man was dressed in all black clothing. Flanagan thought he looked a bit like one of those religious farmers. Quakers, he thought they were called. "Are you getting on, or what?" "I haven't got all night, buddy," said Flanagan. "Do you believe in destiny, Michael?" The Quaker spoke softly. It should have been washed out under the storm, deafened by the thunder, but every word was crisp and cold as ice. "What'd you say?" Flanagan called back. He stared at the man, noticing that his hat and coat were dry, not a speck of rain showing on the fabric. "Our kind has to stick together, Michael. You just watch that tunnel now. A man can get trapped in there." The man's head turned a fraction, too fast, like some glitch.
Who are you talking to?
A quiet voice asked from behind him. "Jesus Christ!" Flanagan said, jumping up from his seat, to see the little girl standing behind him. There was an odd expression on her face. He pointed the torch back down to the doorway. Rain fell in through the open door. The floor was covered with water. The man was gone. Flanagan jumped down the steps and pointed the torch around outside, looking for any sign of the strange man.
There was nobody there.
The little girl looked down at his name tag.
Mike? I looked up as soon as you started talking and the doorway was empty.
Flanagan scoffed at her. He was dressed in black. You just couldn't see him.
I could see the bus stop unless he was transparent. I don't think so.
The girl gave him a look like she was talking to some nut on the street. Flanagan rubbed his forehead as he sat back down and shut the doors. All right. Don't mind me, little miss. I got not much sleep the last while, that's all.
Well, you shouldn't be driving then, Mike. A man can hurt himself driving tired. My Uncle Dave, he was cut in half by a dozing truck driver.
Flanagan looked at the girl in the rearview mirror and was filled with horror as he stared into the darkened face of the Quaker. "It's you!" Flanagan jumped up and looked where he'd been. The little girl stood there shaking her head.
I think I'm gonna get off here, Mike. This is my last stop. I don't want to go any further.
Nah, don't be silly. Look, if you say nothing about this, the fare's on me, huh? What kind of transporter would I be to let you off in this storm? Good, Michael. Very good, a voice whispered. The girl nodded after a moment and walked back to her seat, watching him. She put a school bag on her lap and reached inside. Hey, she's probably got pepper spray in there. Great, thought Mike. He put the bus in gear and pulled off. At the end of the street, he turned left, heading towards the Madison Tunnel. The tunnel? And then Flanagan reprimanded himself. He felt like laughing. He'd never had a good imagination. His wife could attest to that. So to think he could have imagined someone? When the bus was halfway up the street lamps flickered. On, off. On, off. Yellow, dark, yellow, dark. Then they stayed dark. A man could get trapped in there. He could see the Quaker's face in the window's reflection, crouching down and whispering into his ear. Our kind has to stick together, Michael. Be smart now. Come on. Isn't it about time you listen to me? You're not real. Leave me alone. I just want to go home and see my wife. Flanagan tried to swat him off. He was lightheaded, and that was it. Overtired. But you know that's not true, Michael. We must realize the truth in order to change. You must listen to me. You must find peace, sweet Michael. Go away! The man's eyes had begun to faintly glow as he talked. Two tiny red orbs hovering where his eyes should be. The rest of his face still held in shadow beneath the brim. Flanagan's knuckles were white, gripping the steering wheel. Taking his right hand off the wheel, he flexed it, inhaling deeply. Nah, I'm not seeing you. I'm not seeing you. Mike repeated to himself. Denial doesn't make it truth. You deny me now thrice, Judas. Look into my eyes, and I shall show you truth, sweet Michael. Flanagan turned around and faced the man. The bus rattled and shook as it traveled over bumps and puddles, but the man remained erect, seeming to hover in place. He looked into those red glowing embers and saw.
It was an eternal storm hanging over a city of souls. The people were sat by windows or in chairs, staring at nothing. The Quaker was with them, a balance between light and dark, hanging on a precipice as thin as a razor.
Such is the battle that rages behind curtains and within shadow, sweet Michael. Flanagan saw his bus from the outside sweeping past. He saw the window beating at the high towers, the orange moon hidden behind those yellow-grayed clouds, the hopeless eyes gazing up at it. Then he saw a shape in the sky. Something was familiar about it. Something familiar about the way it floated through the sky. Yes, sweet Michael, see. Before your time is up, you must see. But the clouds swirled in the wind. The tempest blew and clawed at the shape until it twisted and shattered and was blown into a million pieces. It was gone in the wind. Flanagan was sat back in the driver's seat. The passengers hadn't moved. He rested his hand on his lap. It was shaking. Looking back at the road, he could make out the lights of the tunnel. As the bus got closer, there seemed to be something in front of it. The bus sped on, the wipers screeched. The roof sounded as if it would cave in from the pressure of the rain at any moment. They hit a puddle, jerking the bus. Flanagan wiped his forehead. His hand returned, covered with sweat. The dark object was getting closer. Is that a car? Broken down? There's no hazard light flashing. Flanagan glanced into the rear view, then back onto the road. The lights outside flickered back on as the object disappeared. He took his foot off the gas, hovered it over the brake. The lights flickered off. The dark object reappeared, 3 or 4 car lengths away. It swerved onto his side of the road. He hit the brakes and the bus skidded, kicking out as it went. "Hold on!" screamed Mike. He could make out 2 horses now, galloping through the rain. They wore harnesses, black plumes of feathers on their heads that blew against the wind. They were pulling a dark carriage, a figure whipping at them from atop it. They galloped straight towards the bus. Flanagan could see the muscles flexing on the horses' bodies, sinews tensing beneath hair. The whites of their eyes glowed. Sparks shot out as their metal shoes collided with the road. He jumped back against his seat, bracing for impact, waiting for the violent clash, screaming. As the horses came into contact, they passed through the glass. The driver of the carriage came closer, the red embers now having cooled and hardened to 2 lumps of onyx that coldly watched him. Time slowed. The Quaker passed within touching distance. His blank, coal-hued eyes seemed to look right into Flanagan's soul. The tunnel, Michael. The tunnel! Quick! Get out! Get out! It drilled into his mind, echoed, distorted. He shut his eyes, wishing for it to end. The bus slowed, coming to a stop as it hit the curb. Flanagan took a deep breath. Opening one eye, peering around, he saw that the road was clear. The street lamps were back on. Sweat trickled down his forehead into his eye. He wiped it away with his trembling hands. What the hell is going on? Looking down the road, the tunnel stood only 100 yards away. What are you doing, sweet Michael? A voice droned behind him. Mike turned, expecting an altogether source of the voice, but finding the 3 passengers all standing parallel to each other. They watched him with blank eyes, pale faces.
We must go through the tunnel,
The girl said.
That's where my family is, and I have to get back to them.
The man nodded. My mother's ill. She's worried sick. Listen. The man brandished the phone to Flanagan. There was a woman stood beside a grave, holding a picture of the man crying. He saw a figure stood behind her, a dark figure dressed all in black who looked up at him. See, said the man, you must get me home. Mike shook his head. I don't want to go through that tunnel. No, not now, not yet, not ever. The old woman took a step forward, and her face filled with compassion.
I know what I am. I will go through the tunnel. Don't be afraid, dear.
Mike opened the door and she stepped out into the storm. She turned and offered a hand to them. The little girl skipped past him and down the steps after the old woman. Mike looked over at the young man who was still holding out the phone. The scene had changed. The grass was now long, the headstone old and faded. You sure you're not going through? I'd rather much be on the bus. The young man had fear in his eyes. I can't. My wife, we're having a baby. It's gonna work. I know it is. Mike saw the young man nod, then fold his phone and slip it into his pocket. Well, then, thanks for bringing me this far, I guess. He walked past Mike and got off the bus, running across the intersection after the old woman and the little girl. The rain had eased off and a thick curtain of fog rolled across the ground, swirling after them in their wake. Mike sat down and shut the door and watched them all disappear into the tunnel. Walking down the plane aisle, Flanagan found seat B13 and put his backpack into the overhead compartment, then took his seat. Last night, it felt like a dream. He put it down to fatigue and that was all. There were no phantoms in the taxi to the airport, no near collisions with oncoming carriages either. A woman put a bag into the overhead compartment and sat down in the seat next to him. They smiled at each other as she buckled her belt. She reached into her bag and pulled out a magazine and began flicking through it. He turned to the window and thought about last night. Maybe it was time he moved out of the city. It seemed like it was getting to him, the night shifts and the lack of sleep. It was too much. The flight attendants were showing the exits now. The plane's engines began to pick up as they started rolling. He'd tell his wife that he was thinking about moving back for good and begin looking for jobs. It would all work out. Terrible accident last night, wasn't it? The woman next to him said. Huh? The tunnel collapsing, you didn't hear? She looked at him, eyebrows furrowed. He felt his pulse weak. What? Where was that? He swallowed. Madison Tunnel. A few vehicles were passing through it when it happened. It was a terrible accident, but if it had happened during the day... She shook her head. He nodded, and she went back to her magazine. Taking his phone out from his pocket, he typed Madison Tunnel into Google to see for himself. Was the man his guardian angel, perhaps? His wife had always told him there were such things, but he never believed her. The ground rolled by outside of the window. It was a sign to get out of New York and back home. A figure walked past in the window's reflection. He caught a glimpse of it. His stomach lurched. He sprang around, sitting up as much as the belt would give. The man stood facing him in the aisle. He could only make out the slight smirk beneath the rim. The Quaker tilted his head back. Those coal-hued eyes pierced into Flanagan's soul, lips breaking into a smile, revealing crooked, sharp teeth. "Oh, you gotta be kidding me." The woman beside him turned to the aisle to see what he was looking at. "Who are you talking to?" She looked back at him. "You can't see him?" he asked, looking at her. Then looking back at the aisle, it stood empty. No, this can't be happening." "Sorry, but you're kind of freaking me out. Can you please stop talking?" She looked startled. "Don't get on this plane, sweet Michael." He unbuckled his belt. The plane began climbing away from the ground, making him wobble as he stumbled past her into the aisle. "Oh no! Stop! Turn it around! Turn it around!" He screamed, running down the aisle towards the cockpit. The flight attendant tried to grab him. He pushed her off and kept running. A large man in front of him stood up. Hands grabbed him from behind. He felt a pressure in his head as someone held him in a chokehold. His vision began to swim. Flanagan could barely make out the black shape further back down the plane. Flanagan could only hear the joyless laughter as he slipped into unconsciousness. His last thoughts were of that laugh, how it seemed to tease him, how it seemed to float from somewhere a million miles away. Jane Flanagan had just gotten out of the shower. She walked into the kitchen with a towel wrapped around her. Walking over to the kitchen sink, she poured herself a glass of cold water and switched on the TV, taking a sip of the cool water. She flicked through the channels and then put it back onto the news. "We've just received some breaking news. Flight 32A4 crashed after takeoff," the reporter on the screen stated.
"Michael,"
Jane whispered as the glass slipped from her grip and hit the floor, smashing. "Why does it feel like I've lived this night before?" Mike thought as he guided the bus down through the darkened street. He looked back in the rearview mirror at the 3 quiet passengers on the bus. The bus traveled down the street and into the dark surroundings, disappearing into the mist. Sometimes it seems that a night can go on forever. Even as the new day dawns, you find your mind slip back into the twilight. Who's to say we all don't exist in an eternal loop? Some soul hanging a carrot and stick over your shoulder, leading you in circles as they leech the energy from your soul. Twisted minds prefer to dwell in the unlit corners of the spiritual plane. Sinister spirits prey on the unwary. And this story is a story about one of those spirits. So, wherever you are, close the blinds, lock the door, and check under your bed, for the Quaker might be watching.